Well, welcome everyone to our third and final session on Humbler Faith, Bigger God. Sam's here with us via the video that we've pre-recorded because he's off doing his fellowship in the States. But it's good to have you with us, Sam. Thanks for making time for this. So we're going to come towards the end of your book and the final chapters, which I think are around the idea that we've been dominant as either the kind of the overarching faith narrative for the Western world and also the ecological kind of domination that has led us to this place of crisis. And so how do we live in that time after domination if we are setting aside that way of being? And I really love what you talked about it's actually in chapter 7, but the David and Goliath, that we admire David, but we always end up becoming Goliath, and Jesus never does. So do you want to unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, it started off as a sermon that I preached in the States years ago, and it stayed. People quote it back to me more than most things that I've done. This irony that you've identified, and the tragedy that. The twofold tragedy that when we recall Jesus as the Son of David, the tendency is to recall Jesus as that David in later years, powerful, ruling over, rather than as the boy with the 5 smooth stones. And then, of course, the other tragedy that David became Goliath when he became older. Yeah. Like Elvis, his swiveling hips became a sort of bloated whale, beached whale. And so when I usually talk about that motif, it's usually to help people reflect on what their 5 smooth stones are, and to be confident that those are all that we actually need. We don't, David in the story rejected Saul's armor. Yeah, he didn't have to be as big as Goliath. He had things that, but so that, the irony is that the church, when the church in the UK and the US, it gets into lament mode, is it the right kind of lament, which is we've lost the skills of the David of the 5 smooth stones, or is it the wrong kind of lament that we used to be Goliath and we wish we were still Goliath? And I go back to a conversation I had with my wife, Jo, 6 weeks after we moved to the States in 2005. I remember saying to her almost tearfully, but it seems so naive now. And I think it felt naive at the time. But, I said, the church here has all the things the church in the UK thinks it lacks: numbers, money, and social influence. But the kingdom of God is no closer. I think it's very instructive for almost any UK Christian to go and spend time in a place like North Carolina. And, Durham was a city of 200,000 people odd. And there were, 700 churches there or something? I mean, it was just over-churched. And yet the issues of race and class, and all sorts of things, but, race more than anything else, were just overwhelming in a sense that I'd never experienced them in the UK. And all sorts of places to go with that David and Goliath story, but to recognize that, misuse of power isn't the only explanation for the ghastly things in the middle chapters of the book, but as you've said, is actually a big part of most of them. We have had a lot of power as the church on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm not sure that we now look back on those periods as golden era periods. So actually our lament for no longer being Goliath is probably misplaced. And that's why I wrote a book called A Future Bigger Than the Past, because I think we have got a chance now to reinvent church as something that's more like David and less like Goliath. But when people are sad about church, I think it goes back to that conversation I had 6 weeks into moving to North Carolina. I think so many people in the church feel that when we were more like Goliath, that was the real thing. I wonder if we were actually further away from the kingdom when we were more like Goliath, and we shouldn't be pining for it.
We recently hosted a day, some of the people on the call might have come to, where we used a tool called Mission Possible, which is a game version of kind of finding the assets and how you might embrace the things that are around you in your community. And when we did it, the facilitator said, we're not giving them any money, because as soon as you give them money, it distracts them because they think that they've got what they need, whereas actually what they need is there anyway. So we took all the cards out before we dealt them out that had all the money on them. And what was so fascinating was when people played that game, they still had buildings. And then a number of the feedbacks from the groups was, well, actually, the building was just such a red herring. It just kept dragging us off topic when actually we were embracing the other gifts. So there's definitely something about we've come to accept that the things we think of as gifts, the things that we definitely need, actually they get in the way of us recognizing the abundance of the other gifts that God gives us, and that sense of kind of that God doesn't gift wrap all the gifts, and we've got so in the habit of only looking for certain types of gifts. And I think that story that you talk about in terms of, you know, Jesus never falls into the trap of trying to be Goliath. That story of kind of humility is that's that sort of overarching motif again when we think about the improvising in Act 4 of the play. So do you want to talk us a little bit more about how Jesus doesn't fall into that trap? What can we see as a motif in that?
I guess the most obvious is entering Jerusalem on a donkey rather than a horse. You know, that would be on a tractor, not a tank, as people have sometimes put it. That seems to me the most obvious renunciation. That would be the central moment in Jesus' ministry when people would have expected him to seize power, where he had popular following, where he had a sense of expectation of a whole new regime that was going to bring in all the things in Isaiah 61, in Luke 4, you know, good news to the poor, and so on, release to the captives. He obviously wasn't about that kind of a project. And our danger, as I write about a great deal in Nazareth Manifesto, is we constantly think we know how to do an incarnation better than Jesus did. We imply in our social ethics and our church practice that we've done incarnations loads of times and God never done one before, and you've got to feel sorry for God in that sense. And there were some mistakes there. It was a bit like talking about Liz Truss. I mean, it was just hopelessly flawed from the beginning. Whereas we, of course, know. And, you know, that's obviously why I talk about so much about the being 30 years of Jesus's 33 years, as we traditionally think of it, as being with years, and that the percentages are 90% being with, not 90% working for. And you know, something I didn't really develop in the Nazareth Manifesto about working for is the degree to which it's actually uncomfortable with the notion of Jesus to be worshipped for his own sake. You know, we've said in the previous episodes about the instrumentalization of Jesus, that working for, in a sense, is looking forward to the point where we don't need Jesus anymore.
Yeah.
Whereas if you think, as I do, that God created the universe in order to be with us in Christ, there is no post Jesus place we get to where we've kicked the ladder away. The whole point is the relationship with Jesus and the relationships with ourselves, one another, and the creation that flow from that that mutual relationship, and you know, respect, togetherness, all those kinds of words that come with mutuality.
It made me reflect on my favourite film is When Harry Met Sally, and they've just broken up, and her friend says to her, but why did you break up? You had a date on public holidays. You know, like this idea that the relationship was to stop her feeling lonely, that using of something. And that, you know, my husband, if I thought about my husband being important to me just because he stopped me feeling lonely, we all see that that's a cheapened and not the depth of it, and that sense that we do use people and love things in our mixed up world at the moment, that sense that we have instrumentalized love, we've instrumentalized it for our self-worth, for all of those things. And I was really struck in the book when you're talking about that being with those of other faiths, for example, or kind of that sort of, how do we learn that when our culture around us, like the water the fish swim in, is all about consuming. We are taught from before we can speak, almost, I think, to be consumers so how do we step outside of that, is that I'm interested to think. And I think being with, not necessarily the course, but definitely the heart of that is that sense of that's what sets us free, that's what liberates us from that consumer mindset. That's how it left me thinking.
Yeah, I think transferability is another word, a bit like instrumentalization, that names the kind of problem. It's very difficult to have an experience. I mean, I do this, I confess I do this. I see the beautiful sunset, I take a photograph, I send it to my family or a friend or something like that. And that sense that the sunset isn't enough on its own. It has to have a transferable quality, which through the photograph it can have.
Photos or it didn't happen. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The positive side of that is I'm telling my family and friends that I'm with them, even when I'm physically in a different place. So you can translate that, but it's a kind of pretty superficial kind of with. And the photograph, the message does that. The photograph doesn't actually. Always the danger is the photograph goes from an act of joy / worship to a way of saying you've got to be impressed with me because I live such an interesting life. And that's where it becomes, I think, a bit problematic. So I think to be able to, the times in each day, I suppose this would be the challenge. There's got to be a time in each day when you put the phone away for an hour, out of range, so that even if it buzzed or bleeped, you couldn't hear it or deal with it, and you give your full attention to somebody. The gesture, it's almost a sacramental gesture to leave your phone in the kitchen while you come into the sitting room and you focus your whole attention on somebody. That seems to me, in a sense, that's what worship asks of us, and that's a place of genuine encounter. And I'm not being nostalgic for the 14th century when they didn't have phones and they were bored all the time. That's one of my favorite quotes, actually, from John Milbank, who says that to be a liberal, you have to believe that everyone in previous centuries was bored. But going back to the 14th century, there are plenty of ways, as I talk about in the sort of 8 dimensions of being with in the Nazareth Manifesto, that you can be present but not attentive. I mean, it's not like a fantasy that in the 14th century everyone really, really listened to each other and they'd all read Carl Rogers books and so on about. That's obviously a fantasy as well. But I think there are some practices we can learn like that, which, that's one reason why I think I enjoy pastoral care so much, because, just in the last couple of weeks, I've sat down with maybe 4 people for quite some time, in each case, and in one case over 2 hours, saying, I've got nothing in my life but you, and we are going to get to the bottom of this pond together, and you're going to tell me the thing you're most frightened of, and the most painful part of this experience, and then we're going to stay with that for a period of time. Those practices, and I think many professions there are, whether it's doing appraisals or whether it's confronting, whether it's having to let staff go. There's a way to do that in an attentive, in a present manner, and there's a way to do that in a way that you're not really looking at the person because you can't quite face what you have to do with them. So I think there's all sorts of ways in which you can enrich most otherwise transactional relationships and make them ones of genuine encounter.
And in the first session, we were talking about that kind of mystery of the relationship that is the forever witness, and that sometimes that feels slightly out of reach, and where it's kind of remembering where to look, isn't it, for that relationship and that mystery. And I think so much of what this book opens up is that you talk about sort of stepping into a mystery isn't a problem to solve, or kind of you don't come away with a solution, you come away with an encounter and a being drawn into. And I think that's some of the discomfort, but also comfort of the stories to live by in this, is that we are stepping into something that's an invitation to mystery, that's an invitation to unity, an invitation to relationship that is beyond our own capability, in essence. And I think somehow that's what sort of stayed with me, I think, from the book, is that we're not this is so not about us. We have a responsibility to one another and to live as faithfully to the Redeemer, so that we look redeemed, to go back to that Nietzsche quote. But it's so not about us, is it?
And I think that does, again, that's very poignant in the face of current society. So in my book Walk Humbly, I talk about the mobile phone and the credit card as the two, quasi sacraments of modernity. The mobile phone says, I don't have to be just with you in front of me. I can be in communication with the whole world. The World Cup can be taking place in Qatar, which, as we're speaking, and I can have it on my phone. It can come to me. And the credit card is saying, this thing that I could only aspire to, I can buy it, and the credit card will cover it, and I'll pay it back. Somehow it'll get paid for. It's all bringing everything into us. Whereas what you're saying is it's we're actually spinning around a reality that's so much greater than ours. But so much of technology is, in a sense, making us God. It's making everything orbit around us as an individual, and you can pull that off for quite a while, because you referred to loneliness and bank holidays and when you're talking about When Harry Met Sally, but almost the worry is that people can become so surrounded by these bits of technology and these binge watching Netflix series or whatever it is, that you don't notice you've got a bank holiday without anybody else, because it's actually easier to relate to the technology than it is to the other human beings. I think there's a real human crisis that we're heading for, and people refer to it in relation to their children as if they weren't going through it themselves. That actually they can relate to the toy, and the toy's ability. And I think social media is about like this, that the sort of three categories of fantasy, the personal, and the public, just all meld into each other, and they become indistinguishable on social media. And I think that resembles what's happening to people's lives. So these are artificial intelligence, I think, in a sense, is the same, but making money out of it. These are the challenges we're facing, in the next generation. I think they are as significant for humanity as the climate emergency is. The climate emergency is challenging. Can we survive? But the other one is can we retain our identity in anything like the form that we've historically known it? Those are both, I would say, equally big challenges.
And the stories to live by are inviting us into identities that perhaps the church hasn't embraced before. That are ways of being that haven't kind of been embedded, and that's hence the critiques of the rival stories that you've been picking up on. And so I think it's not nostalgia for what's gone before, but it's stepping into a mystery. But that mystery isn't it's not that we've got no signpost to it, that there is this bigger story that we can see, and that sort of took me to a place of probably quite hopefulness, I think. I think you said before that some of the people that you valued their critique of the book had found it a hopeful place. And I can see that these challenges don't become less crunchy, less difficult. But as we've said, if we allow them to be gifts to us, then they can be a way to help us find that new way to live.
Yeah, I think I've written the book partly as to say to the complacent, as it were, you've got to take these critiques seriously. They are really damaging, but they could become gifts. But also, I'm saying to the people that, in a sense, rejected Christianity when they were 12 because a relative died, there's a whole depth of discussion and experience that you've closed yourself away from here because you didn't, you couldn't tolerate, well, in my view, because you bought into the fantasy that there was an original deal made, that bad things would never happen to you. And I'm trying to offer in a nimble, light touch way in the book, not just truthful encounter with the real problems, but the real joy, naming the real joy as well. And so probably the book that annoyed me the most that I read was before writing this was a book we read in the theology reading group at St. Martin's pre-pandemic, which was Timothy Keller's The Reason for God. And what was nauseating about that book is it was full of usually young people in their 20s, often a couple who was preparing for marriage or something like that, who would come to see Guru Tim. They would come out with some stupidity, and he would show them which was negative about faith or church or something. And he would, in his wisdom and with reading up on a bit of C.S. Lewis, would give them some brilliant answer. And so the whole structure of the thing was nauseating because it was all about how wise Tim Keller was and how stupid his congregation were, which is obviously a terrible place to start from. But what he didn't have was he didn't have then a way of talking. I don't think sexuality is mentioned in the book at all. Now, in a book written in the 21st century about Christianity, not to mention sexuality, I'm sorry, but you haven't been outside. Even if this isn't your own personal experience, you've got to recognize this is huge. Yeah. But I realized that he couldn't do that because of the structure of the book. The book was, here are the criticisms of Christianity. They're basically stupid, and Christianity fixes it. There was a sort of there was a two-dimensional thing to it.
Yeah.
So by saying here is the old-fashioned Christianity, actually, you and I, regardless of Dawkins and all that, we need to look at some of this stuff because this doesn't bear up to our experience and reality. Yeah. We don't really believe a lot of this stuff, and people should never have believed this stuff in the first place. It was never life-giving and true to the kingdom. So that's all there in the first section. And then you've got, well, here, let's have a look at, let's do what I feel the person that lost their granny at 12 or something has been cross ever since doesn't tend to do, which is let's have a serious look at the alternatives and evaluate those. Well, actually, that doesn't take us that far. So, okay, now let's go back and do an over-accepting. Let's over-accept the problems and see them as gifts. Let's over-accept the critiques and see them as gifts as well. And now let's think, actually, Christianity is about release, as we do in the first of the Being With courses. It's about releasing us from all the energy that we spend recriminating and guiltifying about the past. And it's about releasing us from about terror of our future. It's the forgiveness of sins and the life everlasting is what it comes down to. The benefits of Christ's passion, as Calvin calls them. And it's about this relationship in the present, and it's about a way to live in the present. Mm-hmm. Well, put like that, I can't see anything wrong with any of that. That is as valid as it absolutely ever was. So let's build from there and see what the riches of the scripture actually are when we've stopped asking it questions it can't answer, like, was creation built in 6 days? Those are the things. Once we've stopped asking stupid questions like that, which we know the answers to, and there's no point in pursuing, let's see what is there rather than what isn't there. So I'd like to feel it is hopeful, and obviously it's very personal. It's my story in some ways because I've encountered all these things. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the book. I think, in a sense, for HeartEdge, it's trying to do for our sort of sense of faith and trust what HeartEdge is trying to do for our notion of church, which is to say, actually, we're not trying to go back to the 1950s. It was pretty racist and sexist back then and a whole bunch of other things. But we do have an opportunity to describe now and experience now something far better than that. What a fantastic opportunity. What a time to be alive. What a time to be a Christian. And to get together and realize that, which, we could easily get into the scarcity mindset left on our own.
Mm. I think that sense that we are called to an adventure is huge, because then actually, yeah, what a time to be alive. Exactly that. What a time to be offering some wisdom from tradition and trying to find our way to improvise faithfully in this climate emergency. All of those things are a call to to bring our best selves, not because it's about us, but because if we are with one another, with God, and with our created earth, with that sense of kind of the call to that is, and I don't think we've ever done that well. So yes, it is a story that's bigger than the past, and that does invite us into I think a new space rather than anything nostalgic. So I'm really excited as we kind of come to the end of our sessions, and yeah, thank you for writing it.
Yeah, well, I'm delighted people are engaging with it. I'm really glad that people seem to feel that this threefold structure is actually a model for how we discuss difficult things, with starting with the humility of saying, actually, historically, we've got a lot wrong, rather than, I'm just going to listen out for the weaknesses in your argument, and then I'm going to demolish you. Well, who wants to talk to somebody who talks like that? Hopefully, this is a model for our discussions throughout that sort of HeartEdge imagination, and in a wider sense of how we discuss, difficult issues that arise, and places where the church has got things seriously wrong. So I'm really glad that people are engaging with it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.